The ocean doesn't care about your follower count. It doesn't care about your family name, and it definitely doesn't care about your money. When I pulled Julian Vane from the wreckage of his $100 million yacht, he wasn't a celebrity anymore. He was just a shivering piece of glass I had to keep from shattering. But as the storm pushed us toward a deserted island, I realized the Prince of Manhattan had a secret, and I was the only one left alive to protect it.
The North Atlantic doesn't have a conscience. It doesn't care about the pedigree of the ships it swallows or the dreams of the men it drowns. To the sea, $100 million yacht is just a collection of plastic and glass waiting to be crushed. I've lived on these waters for 20 years, and I've seen it happen a dozen times. The arrogance of man meeting the indifference of the abyss. But I had never seen a wreck quite like the Golden Sky. I was 10 miles out, heading back to the harbor in a gale that had turned the sky the color of a fresh bruise. The Iron Mary, my rusted cutter, was groaning under the weight of the swells, her hull protesting every time we dipped into a trough. That's when I saw it. A flare, a desperate, bleeding red streak against the charcoal clouds. It didn't belong there. It was a cry for help that sounded like a death rattle. When I arrived, the Golden Sky was already a ghost. The sleek, white hull was snapped like a dry twig. Debris was scattered across the churning black water, expensive leather cushions, champagne crates, and pieces of polished teak that cost more than my house. And then I saw him. He was clinging to a fragment of the flybridge, his blonde hair plastered to a face that looked like it had been carved from fine porcelain. Julian Vane. I knew the face. You couldn't live in this country and not know it. He was the Prince of Manhattan, the heir to a real estate empire, the face of 1,000 luxury brands. In the tabloids, he was always smiling, always perfect. Here, in the middle of a November storm, he looked like a broken doll. I maneuvered the Iron Mary with a precision born of desperation. The waves were mountainous, threatening to toss my boat onto the wreckage. "Grab the line!" I bellowed over the roar of the wind, my voice gravelly and raw. He didn't move at first. He just stared at me with hazel eyes that were wide with a terror so deep it looked like madness. He was frozen. I didn't have time for a panic attack. I tied a lead to my waist and leaned over the railing, the freezing spray stinging my eyes. "Julian, look at me!" I roared. His eyes snapped to mine. "Give me your hand or you're a dead man." The moment he reached out and our skin touched, a jolt went through me. His hand was small, his skin soft and cold as ice, while mine was a map of calluses and scars. I hauled him over the gunwale with a grunt of pure effort. He collapsed onto the deck, a heap of soaked linen and trembling limbs. He didn't look like a prince anymore. He looked like a man who had finally realized that his money was useless against the gravity of the ocean. I didn't offer him comfort. There wasn't time. I threw a heavy wool blanket at him and got back to the wheel. The engine was screaming, the Iron Mary struggling against a current that wanted to pull us toward the jagged teeth of Blackwood Isle. "Stay down!" I shouted. He huddled against the bulkhead, his teeth chattering so loud I could hear them over the wind. As I fought the wheel, I looked back at him. He was staring at me, not with the arrogance I expected from his kind, but with a strange, haunting curiosity. He was a creature of glass, and I was a creature of iron. We were trapped together in a world that wanted us both dead. And as the engine gave one final gut-wrenching sputter and died, leaving us drifting toward the dark silhouette of the cliffs, I realized the rescue was only the beginning of the nightmare. We washed up on the shore of Blackwood Isle just as the gray dawn began to bleed through the clouds. The Iron Mary was gone, claimed by the rocks that had shredded her hull like paper. I had managed to drag Julian through the surf, both of us coughing up salt water and gasping for air on the freezing pebbles. We were alive, but we were miles from the world, and the winter was coming for us. For the first 24 hours, I waited for the breakdown. I'd dealt with city folk before. They usually crumbled when the Wi-Fi cut out, let alone when they had to sleep on wet sand. I spent the morning scouting the island, a desolate, rocky outcrop with nothing but stunted pines and a single shallow cave. I found some driftwood and a few rusted cans of emergency rations I'd managed to salvage from the wreckage. When I returned to the cave, Julian was sitting there, his hands wrapped around his knees. His designer clothes were rags, his expensive watch was gone, and his face was smeared with grime. But he wasn't crying. "You're late for dinner, Captain," he said, his voice cracking. It was a joke, a weak one, but a joke nonetheless. "The kitchen's closed," I grunted, dropping a pile of wood at his feet. "Start rubbing these together. We need a fire before the sun goes down, or we won't wake up tomorrow." I watched him. I expected him to look at the wood with confusion, but he got to work. He was clumsy, his soft hands blistering within minutes, but he didn't stop. There was a grit in him, a stubbornness that I hadn't seen in the photos. By nightfall, we had a flickering orange flame dancing against the cave walls. As the temperature dropped, the cave became our entire world. The fire provided light, but the heat didn't travel far. "Come here," I said, my voice low. "If we don't share body heat, the damp will get into our lungs." He hesitated, looking at me, a rugged, salt-stained captain who probably smelled like fish and old tobacco, and then he crawled over. We huddled together under the single wool blanket I'd saved. He was so much smaller than me, his frame fitting into the curve of my chest as if it were meant to be there. I could feel his heart racing, a frantic little bird against my ribs. "Why do you hate me, Silas?" he whispered into the dark. The question caught me off guard. "I don't hate you, Vane. I just don't have time for people who think life is a stage." "It's not a stage anymore," he murmured, his breath warm against my neck. "Everything I had, it's at the bottom of the Atlantic. My phone, my clothes, my father's expectations. I think I'm actually relieved." I looked down at him. The firelight was playing over his features, highlighting the new sharpness of his jaw and the depth in his hazel eyes. He wasn't the shattered prince anymore. He was becoming something else, something raw, something real. I found myself reaching out, my thumb brushing a smudge of soot from his cheek. My hand felt massive against his face, a blunt instrument trying to be gentle. "You're a strange man, Julian Vane," I said. "And you're a hero, Silas Thorne, even if you try your hardest to hide it." That night, the silence of the island felt different. It wasn't empty, it was full of the things we weren't saying. I realized that out here, stripped of our titles and our clothes, the distance between a captain and a billionaire was exactly zero. I was falling for a man I was supposed to despise, and as I pulled him closer to keep the cold at bay, I knew that being rescued would be the hardest thing I ever had to do.
The sound of the helicopter on the fourth day felt like a betrayal. It was a sharp, mechanical thumping that sliced through the peace we had built in our little stone sanctuary. I stood on the beach, the smoke from our signal fire trailing up into a clear blue sky. Julian stood beside me, his hand resting on my arm. He looked like a different person. He was thinner, his skin tanned by the wind and marked by the island, his eyes no longer clouded by the fog of his old life. "They're here," he said. There was no joy in his voice, just a heavy, quiet resignation. I looked at him, my heart feeling like an anchor in my chest. "Go on then. Get back to your skyscrapers and your silk sheets. Your empire is waiting." He turned to me, his grip tightening on my sleeve. "Is that what you think I want, Silas? To go back to being a ghost?" "It's who you are, Julian." "No," he whispered, stepping into my space. "It's who I was." He reached up, his hand cupping my bearded jaw. For a second, the world narrowed down to the sound of his breathing and the scent of the sea. He kissed me then, a desperate, salty kiss that tasted of wood smoke and survival. It was a promise and a goodbye, all wrapped into one. Then the rescuers were on the sand, and the prince was swept away into the sky. Months passed. I replaced the Iron Mary with a newer boat, a sturdy thing called the Debt Paid. I told myself I was fine. I told myself that what happened on Blackwood Isle stayed on Blackwood Isle. But every time I looked at the horizon, I saw hazel eyes. Every time I smelled the salt, I felt the ghost of a man leaning against my chest. I was back in my routine, but the silence of the ocean felt louder than it ever had before. I was on the docks in Gloucester, mending a net, when I heard the sound of a high-end engine. It was out of place in a town that smelled like diesel and fish scales. I didn't look up until a shadow fell over me. "That's a hell of a way to mend a net, Captain." I froze. I knew that voice. It was smoother now, less frantic, but it had that same underlying fire. I looked up and saw Julian Vane. He wasn't in a suit. He was wearing a heavy fisherman's sweater and boots that looked like they'd actually seen some work. He looked healthy. He looked happy. "Julian," I said, my voice even lower than usual. "What are you doing here? You lost again?" He stepped onto the pier, his eyes never leaving mine. "I spent 26 years doing what I was told, Silas. I spent 26 years being a brand. But those 4 days on the rock, they were the only time I felt like a human being. I tried to go back. I tried to sit in those boardrooms, but all I could think about was the smell of wood smoke and the man who saved me." He walked right up to me, ignoring the stares of the other fishermen. "I told you I had a debt to pay, and I realized I can't pay it from New York. I don't want your money, Julian," I said, dropping the net. "I know," he said, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. "That's why I sold my share of the company. I bought the old lighthouse on the North Cliff. It needs a lot of work, and I hear the local captain is a bit of a grouch who needs someone to keep him in line." I felt the anchor in my chest finally lift. I reached out, my calloused fingers lacing through his, the same way they had when I pulled him from the Atlantic. But this time, I wasn't pulling him out of the water. I was pulling him home. "It's a long walk up that cliff," I said, my voice softening. "Then you'd better start walking, Silas," he laughed, leaning in, "because I'm not going anywhere without you. The North Atlantic is still cold, and the gales still blow. But for the first time in my life, I don't mind the storms, because I know that at the end of the day, there's a light on the cliff, and a man waiting for me who knows that the best things in life aren't the ones you buy, they're the ones you survive." Julian learned that the things that matter most aren't the ones you can buy, they're the ones you survive with someone by your side. Every story we tell here is about that spark, that moment when two people find home in the middle of a storm. But a captain is nothing without his crew. Right now, we're sailing toward a massive milestone, and we are exactly 350 subscribers short of our next port of call. If Silas and Julian's journey touched you today, I'm asking you to join us. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. It's the only way to make sure you're on board when the next story breaks over the horizon. I'm Silas, and this is Gay Stories Chronicles. Thanks for being part of the journey. I'll see you in the next one.